Hello everyone, welcome to the channel of the Vietnam War 360 Degrees. Today we'll explore the question why the United States intervened in Vietnam and how the US plan to invade Vietnam was carried out step by step. Watch the entire video to learn more.
And many of you ask this question. Why is the United States spending hundreds of millions of dollars supporting the forces of the French Union in the fight against communism in Indochina? I think perhaps if we go over to the map here, I can indicate to you why it is so vitally important. Here's Indochina. If Indochina falls, Thailand is put in an almost impossible position. The same is true of Malaya with its rubber and tin. Now, may I say that as far as the war in Indochina is concerned, that I was there, right on the battlefield, or close to it, and it's a bloody war, and it's a bitter.
The story begins after World War II, particularly after the successful revolution of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. The United States became concerned with the Indochina region, fearing that communism would spread in this area. CIA documents began to discuss the prevention of communist expansion and emphasized the strategic position of Indochina as a bulwark against the southward expansion of the Chinese Communist Party. At this time in Europe, France held a very important, even crucial position in the formation of the alliance. Thus, the US tried to leverage France's role in the First Indochina War. The US maintained a neutral stance but clearly supported France. The US did not want to put itself in a difficult position by openly supporting colonialism, but also did not want to offend France, an important ally in Europe. Therefore, the US government secretly provided France with significant financial aid. In 1947, the US provided France with $3 billion under the Marshall Plan, equipping 3 French divisions stationed in Germany. On the French side, they understood the US concerns about communism and used this issue as leverage, continuously bargaining and requesting the US to increase aid for France's withdrawal from Indochina. France threatened that if the US did not continue supporting them, they would leave the US to fight communism on its own. From July 1950 to January 1952, the US gradually provided France with $300 million in weapons and military equipment, and agreed to increase the aid by an additional $150 million from 1952 to 1953. The US provided military aid to France and the state of Vietnam. Although France received substantial equipment and funds from the US, they remained concerned about the US direct support for the state of Vietnam. In June 1952, France established an independent state not belonging to the French Union, and the minister responsible for Indochina in the French government declared to the US that France needed increased US military aid, but did not want foreign troops in Indochina. They did not want US military forces directly involved. However, the highest goal of the US was to counter the spread of communism, while France was conducting a colonial war to maintain its presence in Southeast Asia and prevent the collapse of the French Union. Both the US and France wanted to defeat the Viet Minh, but their objectives for achieving this were different. This conflict led the two nations to have different viewpoints and calculations before the historic Battle of Điện Biên Phủ. France wanted to negotiate, while the US insisted on a military solution. The final report of the US National Security Council before Điện Biên Phủ completely still affirmed that successfully defending the North was crucial for protecting the Southeast Asian mainland. Except for Malaysia, the US did not want any negotiations between France and the Viet Minh without a military victory. The US National Security Council report asserted that the US should take all feasible measures to influence the French government to prevent ending the war in a manner inconsistent with US objectives. The US firmly opposed all negotiation proposals and resisted the view that an allied regime was needed in the final stage of the war. The US seriously considered military intervention in Indochina with the help of Britain and other allies. In 1954, facing the clear possibility of French defeat at Điện Biên Phủ, The US proposed expanding the war by mobilizing a large allied force to participate. The US wanted collective action to at least create a favorable political agreement while negotiating an end to the war. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu broke out, and the French military faced serious disadvantages. France urgently requested direct US intervention at Dien Bien Phu, but the US president did not dare to take risks without Congress approval. Meanwhile, the US Congress only agreed on the condition that the US could convince Britain and other Asian allies to join the coalition. However, all efforts to intervene with collective action by the US in Indochina failed. Except for Thailand and the Philippines, the allied nations opposed military involvement at Dien Bien Phu. The British government warned that collective military action would pour fuel on the fire, prompting Beijing to join the conflict, as had happened in Korea. They considered it a foolish military decision and opposed any collective military action. Before the Geneva negotiations, France was also not keen on intervention by a coalition. France did not want to turn Indochina into a land where many other European powers were also vying for control. France was very wary of internationalizing the war because it would lose French control over the region. Internationalizing the conflict could also delay negotiations, while public opinion in France was pressing the government for an early peaceful solution. However, facing the imminent French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, French Army's Chief of Staff General Navarre flew to Washington to secretly discuss a plan for emergency intervention using air and naval forces. A U.S. admiral suggested a swift airstrike at Dien Bien Phu. This plan was called Operation Bolster, involving the deployment of 60 US B-26 heavy bombers from Clark Air Base near Manila, Philippines, to conduct multiple nighttime bombings of Dien Bien Phu. Each bombing raid would drop 450 tons of bombs, and these bombers would be escorted by 150 fighter jets taking off from the US 7th Fleet aircraft carriers. This intense bombing strategy was intended to break the siege around the Dien Bien Phu stronghold and destroy much of the Vietnamese weaponry. However, there was internal disagreement within the US about this airstrike solution. Some senior US military leaders believed that the airstrikes might not only fail to break the siege, but also destroy the Dien Bien Phu stronghold itself. Others feared that air intervention could lead to a broader and larger-scale involvement, potentially requiring the use of ground troops. The matter did not receive consensus within the US political establishment. Therefore, it was only an unofficial proposal and later denied the existence of such an operation. However, the plans for a unilateral US military intervention at Dien Bien Phu certainly existed and were widely discussed. With France and its allies by mid-April, as the situation for France at Dien Bien Phu became increasingly perilous, the French foreign minister called for the urgent US air intervention at Dien Bien Phu as necessary to salvage the desperate situation. General Navarre, the French Army's chief of staff, believed that a ceasefire was the only option if the US could not mobilize mass bombing to rescue the situation, according to Navarre. US air intervention at the Dien Bien Phu front was seen as the only option to save the French garrison units in the critical situation. US Secretary of State Dulles and US Navy Admiral Rafford proposed unilateral intervention with France at Dien Bien Phu. However, the proposal for unilateral US intervention did not receive the green light from US congressional leaders, so President Eisenhower did not dare to take the risk. A plan was proposed to attack the People's Army of Vietnam at Dien Bien Phu with 2,000 fighter jets and aircraft carriers stationed in the South China Sea. If the first airstrike was unsuccessful, a second attack would be carried out. However, ground forces would not be mobilized. It seemed that there were nuclear bombs on the aircraft carriers that could be transferred to bombers. While there was no indication that the US considered using nuclear weapons at Dien Bien Phu and other areas in Indochina, in the event of massive Chinese intervention, it was entirely possible that the US would use the strategic nuclear weapons against Chinese targets. US Congress members were deeply concerned about the lack of Allied participation in the military campaign and the failure to fully assess the risks if China intervened aggressively. The U.S. Department of Defense also calculated that intervention with Navy and Air Force alone could not defeat the Viet Minh. The April 1954 report from the U.S. Department of Defense asserted that Victory in Indochina could not be guaranteed with only Navy and Air Force involvement. The U.S. Department of Defense estimated that, at that time, 7 Army divisions, supported by the Air Force and Navy, would be necessary to defeat the Viet Minh if France withdrew and China did not intervene. If China did intervene, at least 12 U.S. Army divisions would need to be deployed without French support. If France remained, a minimum of 7 divisions would be required, provided there was strong support from the Navy and Air Force with 500 bombing sorties daily. Direct use of ground troops would create significant risks and costs that the U.S. had not yet fully anticipated. Therefore, U.S. Congress did not relight a direct military intervention campaign in Indochina. The U.S. government affirmed that the U.S. would only intervene militarily if there were Allied participation and the backing of Congress. President Eisenhower did not want to take a risky gamble in Indochina, as it could lead to an all-out and widespread war with China. All calculations for direct U.S. military intervention failed, but the U.S. took a wise step ahead. Although not opposing the agreement to divide North and South Vietnam, the U.S. did not sign the agreement to avoid any obligations to implement it. This calculation allowed the U.S. to intervene in Vietnam and Indochina after the Geneva Agreement without being accused of violating the agreement. Later, the U.S. stated that France did not hold the general elections to unify the North and South. Subsequently, the U.S. directly intervened in the war against Vietnam according to predetermined plans. The U.S. goal was not just Vietnam and Indochina, but the entire Southeast Asian region, and this is one of the richest areas in the world, open to whoever wins in Indochina. This explains why the U.S. increasingly focused on issues in Vietnam. For the U.S., it was an area that had to be controlled at any cost. Many historians believe that the long-term basic objective of the U.S. was to protect the existence of a pro-American government in South Vietnam. The goal was not only to counter communism, but also to maintain the long-term influence of American capitalist power in the Southeast Asian market. The result of the U.S. intervention in Indochina consumed a significant amount of dollars and resources. By January 1954, the U.S. had supplied France in Indochina with 360 aircraft, 1,400 tanks and armored vehicles, 390 naval and military vessels, 6,000 military vehicles of various types, 157,000 rifles, and other equipment. After 1950, the United States provided most of the weaponry for the French expeditionary forces in Vietnam. Following the Dien Bien Phu campaign, the People's Army of Vietnam captured a large amount of weaponry originating from the United States. There were 37 American pilots who participated with the French expeditionary forces in the Dien Bien Phu campaign. In 1950, the U.S. only provided $10 million in military aid to France for the war. In 1954, this amount had increased to $2.71 billion, accounting for 78% of France's war costs in Indochina. From 1950 to 1954, the total U.S. economic and military aid to France for Indochina was exceeded $3.5 billion. General Naval later wrote that, during the signing, our status, France, had turned into that of a mere mercenary for the United States. That's all for today's topic. If you would like us to cover any other subjects, let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, remember to like and subscribe to the channel to support us. Goodbye and see you in the next videos.